Okay, so today I am interviewing the legendary Joe Abercrombie. He has a new book coming out, The Trouble with Peace, which is your second book in your second trilogy.
Indeed.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of your books? Oh, it's so beautiful.
Yes. They are edgy yet humorous fantasy fiction, I guess. Some people call it grimdark these days. I'm not a big fan of the term, but
Okay,
that is the one that some people use. Um, and this particular series kind of picks up on a set of books that I've written. I wrote a trilogy called The First Law, and then I wrote three kind of standalone books that are set in the same world. And then I went away to write some other books and came back to this world. And I wanted to sort of move time forward, move the period, if you like, the level of technology forward. And the Industrial Revolution seemed like the next big step that would give me some natural drama and interest. And so these books are kind of a collision of my gritty and subversive take on epic fantasy with the Industrial Revolution, if you like.
yes, you have a very, very unique style to you, and it is one that is, as far as I've seen and experienced myself, very well received among readers.
Well, you'll always find some who would rather have something else. That's
Sure.
true. But generally speaking, I can't complain. Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's stuff that I made up in the middle of the night for my own amusement. So I'm always kind of amazed that anyone is interested at all. But it does seem like there is some audience, at least, for it.
So, do you think that the first law is where you'd like everyone to start, or can people pick and choose a place to begin?
I would like anyone who's reading a book to start with the first law.
Okay.
Yeah, a book of any kind. I mean, I think the idea was always, you get a lot of very big series in fantasy these days. And it's a bit intimidating going into the bookshop and seeing they have book seven in the series, but not book one. And so I
Sure.
wanted to give readers the chance to drop in to the series at different points. So you can start with the start of that first trilogy. That's probably the place that most committed fans would advise you to start. But the idea always was you could read any one of the standalone books on their own. Or you could start with The Age of Madness, the new series as well. The first book of those is called A Little Hatred. So the idea was to give multiple in points so no one has an excuse not to at least buy my books. I mean, reading them, yeah, it's up to you, but definitely buy them. That's always my advice.
Good deal. So I will have the blade itself linked in the description. Actually, I'll just put the box set because there's really
Yeah,
no point in only buying one. You're gonna want the next one, I
I
assure.
agree. I entirely agree. And my mum also recommends them very
Right,
warmly.
right. A completely objective fan.
Absolutely. She's got no skin in this game.
Okay, so today we're talking about prose, writing prose specifically.
Yes. I
I'm
should have
gonna
my suede jacket with the leather elbow patches ready for this.
absolutely.
I wasn't
You're our
thinking.
teacher today. We need you.
Sensei. Yeah, call me Sensei.
So I'm going to start off the discussion by explaining what prose is, because anytime I bring up writing prose, that's always a question that comes up. So
Yeah.
put really, really simply, you have poetry and you have prose. Prose is probably what any novel you want to pick up is written in, unless it specifically states it's written in verse. What we're going to be discussing is intentional and I'll say beautiful prose by someone who, if anybody talks about Joe Abercrombie, they talk about characters, they talk about meaningful and purposeful grit, and they talk about writing prose. So this is a good teacher.
Well, that's nice to hear. I mean, not everyone talks about my prose. I think some people have strange ideas about writing that don't always chime with me. And I
Sure.
think there's this perception that good prose is always lyrical and flowing and kind of complex and full of long words and complexity. And to me, good writing, good prose is that which reflects what you are talking about and that which gets into the heads of the people and the events that are happening. And so, great prose can be really staccato and savage and brutal and fast. It can be written in very simple terms. It all depends on the effect that you're going for.
Okay, that's a perfect way to start this off. My first question for you, and this is all coming from readers and writers that are big fans of your work and want to learn about writing better prose. My first question to you is specifically because in your worlds, you have a ton of different countries and cultures and accents and belief systems and different minds that you get into. And you're able to accomplish these really unique character personalities while still maintaining your very unique writing voice in the narrative. How do you balance all that and do it all so effectively?
Well, thank you for first of all. I guess the kind of writing I always really responded to was writing with a really powerful voice, if you like, the sense of being in the head of either the author or the character who thinks in a way you never would, who has a unique mode of expression. Writers like James Ellroy, the noir writer, he writes everything from a type point of view, but every point of view he writes from is very different, and you instantly have a feel for the character just in the way that he's writing. And I always wanted to apply that to fantasy, I guess. How's it done? I suppose a lot of it is trial and error and refinement in my case. It was kind of what happened instinctively when I started writing, at least to begin with. I'd try and put myself in the shoes of the character. I'd try and think about how they saw the world. I'd try and pick a kind of, at its most basic level, a vocabulary that suited them. So, a relatively uneducated barbarian would use generally very simple terms, but he might have quite sophisticated ways of talking about weapons or fur or snow or things that are kind of very familiar to him within his world. And then you're kind of, I suppose, looking for constructions that suit the character. So an educated, thoughtful academic character might speak in very long and sophisticated constructions with more elaborate punctuation and a bigger word choice, whereas the uneducated character is using much simpler ones. But then it's kind of a process of trial and error where you'll write from their point of view and you'll start to pick up certain patterns that suit the character, certain phrases that you can repeat that seem to get at something of their essence. And then you'll think of things like, structural things within the page, like some characters think in very short paragraphs, kind of short stabbing paragraphs, as if they're thinking very fast, flitting from one thing to another. Other people are slower, lazier in the way that they think. And over time, you refine that voice and pick up on the things that work. And hopefully, by the time you reach the end of a book, you're starting to develop a good idea of exactly what the people are like. And then for me, it's a case of going back and applying that throughout. And I suppose I always like to use this metaphor of Michelangelo's David. Michelangelo was asked, "How do you make David?" And he replied, "Well, I begin with the marble, and then I remove everything that is not David." And so, by the same token, you get to the end of the first draft and then you start removing everything that doesn't fit with your conception of the character anymore. And cutting down is always a very powerful tool. And I go through a lot of phases of revision where I try and distill down the voices of the characters as kind of distinctly as I can.
Okay. So would you say that in the first draft, you're learning your characters, and in the next drafts, you're building on them and honing them?
Yeah, definitely. And I might start with a plan for who the characters are. In the case of this book, a lot of them are the children of established characters, and so they naturally gain some characteristics from their parents and from the established culture and the society that's there. And you've got an idea for who they are, their gender, their age, their profession, their history, their physical characteristics. You can have all that stuff down. But I find until I start actually writing from their point of view, which I try to do quite early in the process, you never really know how they'll turn out. But as soon as I start writing dialogue and try to get into their heads, they quite quickly, hopefully, develop some of that personality. And so the planning and the writing kind of complement each other as I develop their voice during the course of a first draft. And at the end of the first draft, hopefully you've then got a much sharper and better notion of who they are, and you can apply that throughout.
Okay. So your narrative voice, your descriptions, all those prose, all that writing also feels very intentional to me. And like you've thought through exactly what you want to convey with each sentence. Is that also something that comes through revisions, or is that more natural to you?
I mean, it certainly does come through revisions. I think my most natural mode is dialogue, really. When I start a scene, I start with the dialogue, and then I sort of build it up over time. So the dialogue and some of the reactions and the kind of physical stuff that's going on the descriptive stuff tends to come later. And often when I start a book, it will be in a more neutral voice, I guess my kind of natural writing style. And then over time, as I revise it and I come to think more about who the people are, I'll try to make the descriptions in their tone. Some of that happens naturally, and more as you go through a book and you have a better idea what you're doing, you'll naturally kind of take on the voice and the concerns of the people. But as an example, one of the characters in this book is an investor. She makes money. She's a very cutthroat, ruthless kind of businesswoman. And so she sees things and people in terms of what they're worth a lot. She'll describe things in terms of what they're worth, how she can take advantage of them, how she can screw some value out of them. She sees it all that way. Whereas there's another character who is a kind of young warrior. He's very vain, very self-obsessed, and so he doesn't really think much about what his surroundings are. Most of the description is quite simple, quite basic, or it's things that specifically apply to his own very personal concerns. So you're constantly looking for things that personalize the description,
Okay.
and for details in a room, in a setting that the characters can pick up on, that tell you something about them and their attitude to the world.
Okay. That's very helpful. That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
Good. It's a first. I'm making sense.
First time you've made sense.
Yeah, it might be.
What about, so your books have a lot of humor and your characters are very witty. How do you naturally build on that? Is that also something that comes through revisions, or is that something that is fairly natural to you?
I think it is fairly natural. I was always a bit frustrated by the fantasy that I read as a kid, where, very much imitating Tolkien. He was after this mythic, weighty kind of tone. He wasn't really much of a humorist on the whole. And in imitating him, I think fantasy became sometimes a little bit pompous, or it was out and out slapstick. And I wanted to write something that had the kind of humor of just real life and the way people talk to each other. And most of it for me is just what emerges naturally as I'm writing. I don't try to take anything funny out. And as I'm going, I try and cut what is not funny or not interesting or doesn't tell you something about the character. But I often find humor is kind of the best way into a character. What is their sense of humor? What do they find funny? It's a hard thing to describe or kind of apply some sort of science to.
Sure.
It's just what emerges naturally as you have characters conversing with each other, and you're developing their voices, and you're constantly revising and trying to make everything as interesting as you can. So it's natural up to a point, but it's also the result of a lot of kind of revision and going over and trying to sharpen everything up.
Okay. So that actually flows really well into my next question. One thing that you're really skilled at, and I apologize, I'm going to use the term you just said you don't like, but you have the ability to write grimdark in a way that's not just gory violence, but in a way that really exposes humanity. So is there some sort of tool or guidelines that you use in order to be able to do that exposure and have those deeper, more nuanced conversations without blatantly speaking to the reader in a more hand-holdy kind of way?
I suppose the approach to grittiness, if you like, that's how I thought about it when I started writing the books. I wanted to write something that felt gritty and kind of real's always a difficult word to use with fantasy, because you're never aiming at something totally real. You're aiming at something with verisimilitude, as they say, something that kind of feels authentic, feels convincing. And to me, I suppose fantasy books are often very violent. Lord of the Rings is very violent. It's full of warriors and swordsmen and fights, but they're not necessarily described in a really visceral, personal way. And so for me, the gritty elements are about getting in the heads of the characters and trying to convey a sense of what it's like to be part of those events, not just to kind of describe them from a distance, but to describe their emotional impact and the feeling of being there, to sort of catch little details that flash at people in the heat of action and the heat of the moment. Whether there's a specific balance or a way of approaching them, I guess, again, I'm going to say this probably quite a lot, but a lot of it's sort of instinctive in just how you tackle a scene. You plan for something, and you try to make it convincing and believable. You try to make the motives of antagonists kind of as believable as those of the protagonist. And remember, everyone's the hero in their own head, as it were. So hopefully, keeping those things in mind and try to stay honest, and describe things as you think they are, rather than reaching for easy cliches and kind of straightforward things. You'll naturally make something feel believable and truthful. I think that's often the key to good writing. Is something my mum told me very early on. I'd use some ridiculous metaphor like, the sky was a sable cloth with diamonds spread upon it, or something nonsense like that. A sort of easy cliche, and she said, does the sky look like that? I mean, does it really look like that? And you think, well, no, only in the kind of most obvious, basic way. It doesn't really get at anything particularly truthful. And she said, you've always got to be truthful. You've always got to, ask yourself, does it look like that? Is it like that? Is that image true, rather than just easy and convenient and sounds good? But when you actually think about it, it's not saying anything. Is it honest? And so I think the approach I try and take, and I'm sure I fall short many times, but is always to ask yourself, does this feel real and believable? The behavior of the characters, at least, even if the world is larger than life and intense in the way that you expect and desire from fantasy, does it feel like it's truthful? That's important always.
That's interesting. So one question that did come up a lot was, how are you able to create such beautiful, thoughtful prose without being indulgent? And I think that you just answered that. Are these prose, or is this prose honest? Is it truthful, or is it indulgent?
Yeah, and I mean, often that's about the character as well. If a character's
True.
blunt and honest, you want the prose to feel blunt and honest.
Right.
Whereas in Better of Cold, say, there's a poisoner called Morvir, and he is this incredibly self-obsessed guy. He thinks he's much cleverer than he is, and he speaks in this elaborate, lush, sort of overwrought, like a bad writer, really. It's very easy for me to do, naturally. And so for him, it becomes honest and it becomes right that the thing is very overwritten and a bit pompous and ridiculous, really, because he's quite pompous and ridiculous.
Okay.
So I suppose it's truthful. It's about being truthful, and it's about being true to the characters and the point of view and the people, and trying to get as much of their personality into the writing as you can.
So would you say that you sculpt your prose around the characters' personalities then?
Yeah, very much. I mean,
Okay.
that's sort of always my first. Well, that's where I'm trying to end up. I mean, it's maybe not how I begin, because I might start with descriptions that are more in my kind of natural voice, and then think more about refining them. I write with, I'm going to be fancy now, I tend to write quite a lot of alliteration. I'm quite into rhythm, and so I'll write these rhythmic and alliterative, quite listy. I'm a bit listy.
Sure.
That's one of my shortcomings that I'm always trying to be conscious of. And that's how I tend to describe things early on. And then when I come back to them, I'm thinking about the character and the point of view that's looking at them, and then I try and break them up and make them a bit more specific to the person. So some people are kind of, might be alliterative and a little bit poetic in the way they talk, in which case that's fine, but others, are looking for something much more blunt and straightforward.
Yes, that's now I feel like I need to change the subject. I need to ask you how to write characters instead of how to write prose.
Okay, yeah. But it's the same in a sense. I mean, they're all interconnected, aren't they?
Sure. Pretty much covered all the questions I had, because it all seems to wrap up to you in learning your characters and then writing through who they are. So I want to ask you this.
Yeah.
How do you meet your characters? How do you learn them? Because you can get into a character's head and state of consciousness on a level that I probably haven't seen very many authors do, where I have never read one of your scenes and thought, oh, the plot needed to happen. It has always felt like the characters' motivations, their actions are always completely realistic, even if it means going somewhere that's really difficult. So how do you write your characters so honestly, each and every individual one?
Yeah, I mean, I am always a big believer in taking as much of the magical thinking as possible out of writing. I think it's easy to see writing as this special kind of art that is very hard to understand and see into. And I try and avoid that as much as I can, and to think of it as as work, and to break it down into small, obvious little steps that you can do one by one, where there's no mystique there. I kind of believe the muse visits when you're at your desk, so you've got to get going, and the less you think about it as magical stuff, the easier it becomes to make progress. But at the same time, with characters, which are to me really the most important part of the whole process, there is an element of magic there. You never really know how they're going to work, and you're never totally sure where the voices come from. I mean, the weird thing, and it still feels weird to me, is that if I write dialogue between two characters, it's me talking to me in a way. It doesn't feel that way, and hopefully doesn't read that way. You know, it ends up reading like they're quite distinct people. I suppose a lot of it is just what happens when I start writing from that point of view. So, you know, I'll plan roughly how a book will be, and then I'll look at the first part of it and break it down into chapters, think of who the points of view are going to be, think of what action I need to cover. And then quite quickly I'll start trying to write. And quite quickly, once I start writing, a feel of the person emerges. Sometimes it's very much what I expected, and sometimes it takes you by surprise and sort of takes a rapid left turn, and the person feels somehow different than you were expecting them to, which is always nice in a way, because it feels like they're asserting themselves a little bit and their voice is starting to emerge quite early on. I guess I've got better at it over time in a sense. I think you're always trying to recapture a sort of exuberance you had with your first book, with your early work, but at the same time your craftsmanship gets better to compensate. And so their voices kind of start to emerge quite quickly as I'm writing. And I'll try different things. You know, I'll try thinking about, is this someone who sees the world mostly, or are they listening to conversations more, or are they smelling things a lot, or are they someone who, you know, thinks about color? Are they someone who thinks about light? You know, what's something that gives you something distinctive about the way they see the world? And then if something seems to work nicely, then you start applying it elsewhere. Ferro, who's a character in the first series, she's colorblind, and so she never sees colors. Everything's described as dark or light, and it gives her descriptions this kind of slightly clinical feel. But her eyesight's very good, so she sees lots of details, but never in color. It's always sort of drained of color and drained of emotion somewhat. And she thinks in these short paragraphs, which then have a little drop line, like a single punchline, if you like, afterwards. So it's short paragraph, punchline, short paragraph, punchline. That's the way she's arranged, and the rhythm of it gives a kind of sense of this punchy, aggressive thought process that she has. So that's, you know, one approach. Then Glockter, who's another character from those books, he has an italicized thought process, and you know, he'll say something and then there'll be his thoughts in italics, which often are at odds with each other because he never says quite what he thinks. And so it's a sort of almost becomes an authorial commentary on what he's saying and doing, his own commentary on what he's saying and doing. And I tried that with his daughter, who appears in these new books. I tried to do the same thing, and it didn't really work. You know, I tried it for a part, and I found I was trying very hard to think, what will I put in these italicized thoughts? With Glockter, it always happened effortlessly, but with her, it was more of an effort to find something. And so I started thinking, maybe I don't need it. And I think in the end, he thinks what he can't say and doesn't want to say, whereas his daughter just says what she thinks. You know, so the joy of her is you don't need her italicized monologue. So the style sort of develops as I go, and with trial and error, see what works.
Okay. So it sounds like learning your characters' voices is very natural to you as you write them. Do you ever find yourself sitting there saying, I can't figure this character out. I can't figure out who they are. And if so, how do you overcome that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yes, I do. I think as well, without thinking about it or without realizing it, when I wrote my first book, those characters had been with me for years. That was the book I'd always thought about writing. So their voices appeared quite naturally. It didn't feel like it at the time, but when I came to write a fourth book, which was kind of my difficult second album, if you like, with new characters that were being made up on the spot, I found some of those very, very difficult to work with. Often I find the secondary characters, if you like, the ones who are quite intense people, but they're maybe not normal people, they're not the ones who are driving the plot forward, who have the arcs and the development in the story. they're quite easy to write because they
Right.
usually have a simple tick or a simple kind of in. There's a
Hmm.
convict who's obsessed with numbers in Best Served Cold, and so his chapters are all about, he sees the world in numbers. He rolls dice and is obsessed with sums and numbers, and that's kind of easy, but it's also pretty simple. You wouldn't want a whole book of it. It's good
Sure.
as light relief. The characters who carry the story on their shoulders, whose decisions are really guiding the plot, they're much more difficult to do. And often I'll have a character who doesn't seem to be sparking or really producing a much personality. Some work instantly, which is great, but some, yeah, often it's not till you get to the end of a book that you think, okay, what have I got? What works? What doesn't work? Do I need to cut something out? Do I need to change the way this person is? Do I need to change their name? You know, sometimes a different name can give you a new insight into the person. Getting a photograph, you know, it's not something I normally do, but sometimes you'll see an actor or a person in the public eye and think, oh, yeah, that person's got something, some glimpse of something that seems to get at the heart of a character. I mean, there's a character called Broad in these new books, kind of a big guy, a bit prone to violence. They're trying to avoid violence, but constantly drawn into it. Bit of a classic theme of mine. And I'd been writing, I was halfway through the series, and I saw the recent Blade Runner film, which has Dave Bautista in it at the start. I don't know if you've seen it, but he's obviously this huge guy, and he has these tiny little glasses. And there's just something about the huge guy with the tiny little glasses, the sort of the dainty, almost, they look a bit silly, but it speaks to some level of weakness, the weak eyes, I don't know. And that just seemed to get at something that worked really nicely with that character. So I thought, he needs glasses. And with
Interesting.
the little specs, you see, he can both have these weak eyes, so he sees the world a bit blurred, but also then when he takes the glasses off, you can't see anyone. They just become these anonymous people. And so when violence comes, he takes off the glasses and the world becomes this blurry mess. So it just
Wow.
worked really nicely.
Yeah, I've actually found I'm a very much an amateur writer, but I've found that when I'm trying to figure out a character, a lot of times I'll go to Pinterest and I'll
Hmm?
scroll portraits. And every now and
Yeah.
then I'll find one and I'll say, that's my character. And just looking at the portrait, I'll suddenly know that character a little bit better when I find the face that matches and the tone that that portrait is giving off.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any ticks like that that you go to, any tools that you go to?
I mean, that's not one I generally use for every character. I wouldn't start by doing that. But if I'm having trouble with a character, I definitely would think, okay, is there an actor who's got some of the energy that I'm after, you
Okay.
know, that I can sort of put in their place and imagine what's that person like, what's their tick, what's something I can describe about them. Or I'll think, you know, is there some tick I can give them, some sort of mannerism, some problem, some issue that can give me a little way in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any one sort of ritual or one approach. It's whatever works under the circumstances, and every book sort of throws up different issues. Every cast has different members that work at one time and not at another. So I think the main thing I've learned is just that you'll find a way through it in the end. So even when it can be really worrying if you're feeling like a character doesn't work, you feel they're boring, you don't feel you understand them.
Right.
Um, but over time, there are ways you can always go back and rewrite. And
Yes.
a lot of what I do is rewriting. You know, I spend as much time rewriting a book as I do drafting it, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the things don't change massively in terms of the events and the dialogue often, but the detail of the writing changes quite a lot
Okay.
in those process of revision.
Did you write a lot of books before The Blade itself? And how long did it take you? Because The Blade itself is, I mean, you're probably tired of me hyping you, but The Blade itself is a masterpiece. And
You'll
it's
be
your first
amazed how I
published book.
never get tired of being hyped. It's incredible.
It's
Infinite
your first
appetite for that.
published book. There are so many authors where, you know, you get recommended their series and you say, you know, the first book is good, the second book or whatever. You don't have to say that with your books. How many books did you write before The Blade itself? How long did it take you to hone your craft like this?
It was my first book.
No,
Yeah,
stop.
yeah,
No.
yeah. Yes way. Well, it was, but I suppose I'm not someone who writes a lot of things and trunks them. I tend to just batter away at the same thing. So I spent 4 or 5 years writing that book, I think.
You spent four or
Um,
five years before you published your very first book, and it looks
yeah.
like that. You're gonna make
Well,
everyone watching this video feel bad about themselves.
I mean, what can I say? It was just really great from the start. I had tried to write previously, like 8 or 9 years before that. I tried to write the same thing, and that was really bad.
Okay.
That was pretty terrible. It had none of the sort of tongue-in-cheek quality that the the blade itself had when I started writing it later. Um, I suppose I just spent a lot of time revising it and going over. To begin with, I mean, I spent maybe 6 months writing the first 4 or 5 chapters and just going over and over them and refining them and thinking about what worked and what didn't, and just trying to work out how to pace things, how to use dialogue, when to use thought, and just experimenting with the voices and defining the voices of the people, and trying to just work out how to write, really. But yeah, that's the only. I don't have any books that I'd written before that, really. Nothing serious. That was the first thing.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it just worked well. I mean, I do think that when I look at it, I certainly see a lot that could be improved upon.
Well,
I think
sure.
there's a lot that works really well that I'm very pleased with, but definitely it could do with a lot more plot. I think that book. But I think partly because I was spending a lot of time experimenting with the writing and the nuts and bolts of it. The plot doesn't appear till later because
Hmm.
I started thinking, okay, I need a plot now, and that maybe shows slightly still.
That's so funny. So when I read The Blade itself, I remember in my review of that book, I said, there's basically no plot here, but it felt so intentional, like he was building up his characters and his world first, and then the plot will be introduced. So it was so intentional that it felt right. So you fooled me.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a degree to which I wanted that because I think as well, a lot of the fantasy I read, the heroic fantasy of the 80s and 90s, was it follows the Lord of the Rings. It's almost like a scientific paper. It starts with an introduction. Okay, now this is what we're going to do. Frodo, we're going to take the ring to Mordor, right? And then
Sure.
various steps along the way. And then you have various steps along the way, and then they end up in Mordor. So
Yeah.
they're often quite foursquare, and you sort of understand very quickly, okay, here's what the world is, here's the enemy, here are the stakes. Whereas something like LA Confidential I was talking about earlier, it starts with these people in their world, and there is no plot. Things happen. You're not sure how it all interrelates. There's a set of characters all with their own concerns, all in their own place, and they gradually come together and are drawn together, and you find that the threads they're following all kind of come into one rope, and you realize what that is at the end. And so I did want to kind of take that approach to start with the people, see how their world is, see how they're bedded in, and they're all kind of following a thread, and eventually that comes together. But I think some sense of how that's happening, and the stakes and things there being some narrative thrust is
Hmm.
still useful. And so I'd do it a bit differently now. I don't think I'd do it a lot differently, but I'd do it differently.
Okay, so I have one more question for you.
Sure.
Do you have any either nonfiction or fiction that you would recommend as far as what you found useful in learning your voice and in honing your craft?
Well, yeah. I mean, I suppose in a way, every book that you read and love, has works its way in there somewhere.
Hmm.
It all goes into the brain soup, and also stuff that you don't like. That goes in as well, one way or another. So you're influenced by everything. But I mean, certainly books that have a really strong and powerful and individual voice always have a marked effect on me. So I mean, I've talked about James Elroy quite a bit. Game of Thrones, when that appeared, that you may not have heard of it, but I think it will be a
It's
big
not
book
very
one of
well
these
known.
days.
Yeah, somebody
I
will
think,
discover it.
yeah, I think it'll come good. That sort of showed me that you could do something very character focused and point of view voice driven within fantasy. So that was certainly a big and important book for me. And then things like The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, Junot
Okay.
Diaz. That's a great book for voice and kind of sense of humor and just a unique way of looking at the world comes flying off the page. Cormac McCarthy is a writer that I love. I mean, I don't know if there's a lesson to be drawn from Cormac McCarthy because his stuff is so intense in the voice, you know. And if I read him, then I end up writing like a crap Cormac McCarthy for a couple of weeks afterwards, which is maybe not a good thing, you know. But it's a style and an approach to the prose like no other, and it has a kind of incredible rhythm to the way that he writes, which I think is kind of horrible and beautiful at once. Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry is a Western with just fantastic characters and fantastic dialogue and just a beautiful interaction of people. And then Elmore Leonard is a writer that I love for just kind of effortless prose. It's not fancy at all. It's on one level incredibly workmanlike, but on another level he just sketches people with this amazing deftness. So, you know, someone will say a line and they'll do an action, and you have a realised person there. I can remember reading one bit of his where he introduced this character who just says something. He's doing something with his hat. He's playing with his hat, and the way that he's doing it just straight away gives you some insight into who the guy is. And it's just so unassuming the way he does it, and yet he'll just create every extra feels somehow like a real, fully realised person. The joy of writing is just the infinity of different ways you can approach it, the different things you can concentrate on, the different tone that every good writer has, you know, and their different concerns, their different voices. This is the joy of it, I think.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Oh,
this has been so insightful. Prose is something that I struggle with. I struggle with liking my prose, so I was very, very excited to be able to chat with you, and I feel like I've learned a lot. I think
thank you.
People are going to be happy.
Yeah, I hope so. Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. It's always nice to talk to people.
I will have Joe's first trilogy linked in the description. Strongly, strongly recommend. I'll also have my video, Why You Should Read The First Law, linked if you need more convincing. Joe, is there anything else you want to chat about before we sign off?
No, just you know, happy to be here, and I advise everyone to go out and immediately buy my books.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.